This is a CBC podcast.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Well, BC is on the edge as COVID-19 cases rise, but can still curve the bend back down, according to Dr. Bonnie Henry, who also said that in controlled circumstances, maintaining a 1 meter distance is good enough. What's your takeaway from the latest modeling and messaging on COVID-19 in BC? Plus, calling all gardeners, Brian Minter will swing by to take your questions after 12:30. I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to this Friday edition of BC Today. Dr. Bonnie Henry warns BC could be on the verge of a serious spike in cases of COVID-19. 89 new cases were announced yesterday, with 1,175 confirmed active cases. Henry also shared the latest in COVID-19 modeling for BC. And here's some of what she had to say at yesterday's press conference.
So we are keeping a fine balance, but it is at the edge. And it's because most people are taking the precautions that we know work. Let's make sure this Labor Day long weekend we are united in our singular focus to continue to stop those chains of transmission and bring our curve back down. And of course, let's continue to do this by being kind, being calm, and being safe.
I'd like to hear from you. How are you feeling about the latest numbers, the latest modeling and messaging on COVID-19? How concerned are you about the case numbers in BC? Give us a call. 1-800-825-5950 is the toll-free line around the province. In Metro Vancouver, the number is 604-669-3733. And on your cell phone, it's star or pound 690. You can tweet us at BC Today, or you can email us, bctoday@cbc.ca. And my guest is Raywat Deonandan. He's an epidemiologist and associate professor in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of Ottawa. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Very well, Dr. Deonandan. Thank you for joining us. What do you take away from the numbers in BC and the modeling that's being presented?
Oh, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, what hasn't changed is that in Canada, the epidemic is pretty much an epidemic of 4 provinces: BC, Alberta, Quebec, and Ontario. And we've had some spikes in Manitoba and Saskatchewan as well, but it's still those 4 provinces that are the problem. And BC has been the golden child for much of this. You showed us how to flatten the curve, but yet in the last few weeks and months, there's been some troubling trends, as you've noted. And I'm glad that people are getting serious about it. And the modeling does suggest that the problem is the extent of socialization. Mm-hmm. So there's no mystery here about what's going on. It's a matter of human behavior. And I like that there is a finger pointing at the limit or the threshold of socialization that is tolerable. I think 60% was the number that was cited. I'm not sure. But yeah, that's what I take away from this. It's critical as schools open to get this number as low as possible, because the number one way to keep schools safe is to keep the transmission rate in the community as low as possible. And that's not being done right now. So we have to do that.
Yes, you said we were somewhere at 65% of normal interactions right now, right at this stage anyway, but and trying to keep that down, of course. But you're right, you're looking towards the next stage here, which is the reopening of schools. So what is top of mind for you? The finger pointing, as you say, has been at those social interactions over the summer. But as we head into the new school year, what will you be looking for in terms of measures that are needed?
Okay. There's always 3 main metrics we look at for the degree of transmission in the community or in certain institutions. Number 1 is the number of new cases per day. And as noted, BC is edging up to 3 triple digits per day, which is not good. Number 2 is this thing we call the reproduction number, and that is the average number of new cases produced by an old case. We like that to be less than 1. For most of the summer, BC has been under 1. If you look at a 5-day average, I think recently you've exceeded 1, which is not good. So we want to keep that number below 1. And 3 is the test positivity rate. That is the percentage of tests that you do that come back positive. We like that to be below 5%, which is a fairly high threshold, but in my books, less than 1%. So that will change quickly in the next couple of weeks because we definitely anticipate you're going to get some outbreaks in schools. But to me, the question isn't so much when you get the outbreaks. The question is, what do you do when the outbreaks are detected? Because they're going to happen. But the public health challenge is, how do you suppress them when they happen so that you can continue to have the machine moving? You don't need to close schools if you have a plan in place.
Let's listen once again to Dr. Bonnie Henry.
We know that giving people the space to stay safe is very important for all of us. For the first few months, we spent a lot of time in this pandemic talking about giving 2 meters between people outside our bubbles. And we've talked about the importance of wearing masks when you can't maintain that. 2 meters is the ideal, we know, for uncontrolled environments, particularly with people we don't know. But 1 meter is also good if you're with the same group of people you know and see regularly, such as work colleagues, classmates, for example. Close face-to-face contact for extended periods of time with anyone outside your household bubble should be avoided.
So, Dr. Deonandan, what do you take from that then? Is that a shift? Might that be confusing for people?
It's definitely confusing for people. And so the consistency in messaging is a bit disappointing. However, people need to understand there's nothing magical about that 2 meter cutoff. In fact, around the world, different countries use different cutoffs. What we know is that droplets travel a certain distance, and droplets come in a variety of sizes, and some fall short and some fall further. But in general, there was a study put out by the Lancet that showed that within 1 meter, you've got a 13% chance of having an incident droplet fall on you and affecting you. When you're beyond 1 meter, that probability drops to about 3%, and every meter after that, the risk drops by another half. So in China and Denmark and France, they have a 1 meter rule. In South Korea, they've got a 1.4 meter rule. In parts of Europe, they got 1.5 meters. In the USA, it's 1.8 meters. Canada has the largest threshold, which is 2 meters. So it's not inconsistent with science to say that 1 meter is sufficient. It's just troubling that the messaging has been inconsistent, and I can see how that can be dispiriting to some people.
So how do we interpret that then? In what kinds of scenarios would that 1 meter be acceptable?
Well, that's a good question, right? So in general, if I can speak vaguely, I mean, a lot of countries around the world have accepted 1 meter for shopping malls and for commercial interactions. Now, that can be argued that that's a matter of just convenience. They want people in the stores, so you reduce the distance rather. But it's safe to say that if you're around the same people all the time and those people are relatively safe and have no other exposures, you can probably get by with 1 meter if it's consistent and enforced. And if there's a mask and other barriers in place, well, then it gets safer still. Keep in mind, none of this guarantees safety. It's all just mitigates transmission. There are also other factors at play. There's the volume of speech. Kids will speak with a lower volume and project droplets a lesser distance, I presume. There's the duration of speech. So singing is going to be a little worse than talking. And there's the size of the room and the amount of ventilation. So we haven't talked about how much the filtration systems and the filtering and the ventilation system is critical here, but it really is. Because the droplets only matter for one mechanism of transmission. But aerosol transmission, that's when the stuff goes airborne, is still responsible for a fraction of the cases. And that really doesn't respect the distancing. That's more about the ventilation requirements and limitations.
That's another part of the conversation as well as we head into the school year. We're taking calls from listeners as well, asking you what your reaction is to the latest numbers and the latest modeling on COVID-19 in BC and the messaging too. How are you left feeling after hearing that message from Dr. Bonnie Henry? 1-800-825-5950. In Metro Vancouver, 604-669-3733. On your cell phone, star or pound 690. Pete is calling us from Vancouver. Hi, Pete. What are your thoughts?
Hi. I think it's important for all BCers to remember that Bonnie Henry is one epidemiologist. She is not the only epidemiologist in the world. And a lot of them are asking for more than 2 meters because of aerosols. And I would encourage all of your listeners, knowing that not just political bureaucrats and politicians of all stripes claim that they're the best, they're the world class, go see what their records are. Go to Worldometer and sort by COVID deaths per 1 million population and compare BC to that. And one thing that's not being discussed is that there's a new study on ADHD and COVID, 14,000, and showed that people with ADD had higher rates than people with diabetes, hypertension, and chronic lung disease catching COVID.
So
and the biggest number of kids in special needs is ADHD.
As an underlying condition. What do you take then if you're going to look at records from each country? I mean, has BC not been doing fairly well?
No, not at all. BC is claimed to be world-class and we're at the leading edge, but we're about 100 down the list on COVID deaths. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, right, it's not what you say, it's not how you say it in a pandemic that causes death. What really counts is what results. And look at the person's results, regardless of the person or the ideology, like Liberal, BC-NDP. What have they actually received? And
we'll get to the numbers then with our guest Pete. Thank you very much. You bring up a couple of points there, in that different provincial health officers have differing approaches as well, differing views on certain issues. But what about that? Just on the numbers, Raywat Deonandan, I'd just like to go to you to take us through them. How well is BC actually doing? What is our record?
Well, there's a lot of ways to compare the records across the country and internationally. So compared to across the country, BC is doing fairly well, but you're not the leader. I mean, the leaders tend to be out east, the maritime provinces. But there's so much to unpack there, because a lot of this is driven by the community effects, the community transmission rates, which are susceptible to, is there an airport present? What's the population density? What's the rate of travel, etc. Internationally, we can learn a lot from certain key countries, the Asian countries in particular, like South Korea, and Denmark. Denmark, to my mind, had one of the best school opening plans, and we're not taking enough from their experience. The takeaway from them is that this is not just the job of the school system or the public health system. It's everyone's job. So they've got situations like parks are reserved just for school kids. So you can expand your class into parks safely and use that as an outdoor learning environment. Hotels donate their conference space so that schools can have larger distancing opportunities. So everyone's on board. And that's a message I think that's not getting through across Canada, is even if you haven't got a kid or work in education, you have a role to play in reducing transmission rates in the community such that schools stay open, such that the economy stays open, because this is critical. Keeping schools open is critical. We can do a lot more, including, providing resources in school to allow for greater distancing and for better staggered hours and lesser exposures per child.
I want to just get through some of the other statements made by our caller there. He was talking about ADHD as an underlying condition, perhaps, that contributes to becoming more susceptible to COVID-19. What do we know about children and what makes them more vulnerable?
Right, it's a very good question. And fortunately, I'm not up on the current literature there. I do know that kids are different from adults. They're manifesting this disease in different ways, and they're about 3 times more likely to be asymptomatic. So, and that might be borne out in the ADHD cases. So maybe ADHD kids are more likely to get it and are less likely to be symptomatic, and that's driving the disproportionate number of child carriers. So what we do know is that kids are less likely to have serious outcomes, which is good. Kids are less likely to die, which is fantastic. But when you scale the numbers up enormously, as we will for mass school openings, someone's going to get it and possibly someone's going to die, which would be horribly tragic and unacceptable. And we also know that kids are just as likely, if not more so, to transmit it to other people, including the adults. And one of the reasons kids are more likely to transmit it is that kids have, on average, more social contacts per week than adults do. So they have more opportunities to get it and more opportunities to transmit it. So it's one thing to control child interaction in the school, but we haven't talked about what to do for after school hours or for transportation or with siblings from different cohorts living in the same house. All of these are cross-contamination opportunities that public health, frankly, can't control.
you're talking about things like school buses, for example. Want to hear from our listeners on this too. We have an email from Hazel who writes, it's disturbing that about 80% of shoppers here in Nanaimo are not wearing masks. I've heard that coronavirus aerosols hover in the air for at least half an hour. We have heard that even outside it should be recognized. Please ask Dr. Henry to emphasize mask wearing first and distancing second. And in terms of what she's seeing, Hazel writes, how many bubbles do these people have? Obviously more than one. For now, I will only shop at stores that enforce masks. So will other thoughtful, considerate people. Hazel, thank you for that opinion. Frank is calling us now from Langley. Hi, Frank.
Hi, how are you, Michelle?
I'm fine. Thanks for calling. What are your thoughts on the latest numbers?
Just a couple of points. Your guest made a really good thing just a moment ago, saying that we're all in this together. And I really think that, in my view, what I'm noticing, about 80% of the population in shopping malls, stores, public places seem to be in it. Lots of people are wearing masks. Certainly in this community, lots of people are wearing masks when shopping. But, we had an experience the other day. We were on the BC ferries from Tsawwassen to Victoria just for a day trip. And it's a mask mandatory in the terminals and on the ships.
Right.
And that's what we noticed everywhere except in the open deck area where numerous people were not wearing masks. They were not taking them off to eat. They just weren't wearing them, and some didn't even seem to have them with them. And this is the thing that's bothering me a lot about the response to this is most people are trying to do the right thing, trying to do what they're asked to do, but there's still a significant minority who are not willing to do that at all.
Okay.
And I think that's putting a lot of other people at risk unnecessarily.
I'm just on the BC Ferries website, and there's a Q&A, frequently asked questions page, and it says, am I required to wear a face covering while in exterior spaces? It says you are required to wear one in the following areas: parking lots, outdoor waiting or seating areas, lineups to enter terminal or ticketing areas, as you mentioned, Frank, vehicle holding lanes, lineups to board or disembark, at all times while boarding or disembarking, exterior decks of a vessel as well, and in designated pet areas. So it sounds like it is required in those areas, but you're saying that you saw quite a few people who weren't. Is that going to be an enforcement issue then when it comes to BC Ferries? Frank, thank you very much for that observation. How important is mask wearing now, Dr. Deonandan, and how important is it that more people, that most people around you are wearing them?
It's important, but it's not, the most important thing. The most important thing, according to the statistics, is distancing. So keeping 2 meters, we talked about the distance, but 2 meters has a very strong statistical effect on the rates of transmission. If you cannot distance, then mask wearing helps a lot. It helps enormously. And remember, my mask protects you, your mask protects me. And the mechanism is that it simply slows the rate of transmission of those droplets so they fall faster to the ground. It doesn't solve the aerosol problem, however, for most people, because the aerosol nuclei are smaller and they can penetrate most masks, but it helps enormously. So the question of what number you need for the number of people to wear the mask to make a difference, we're not entirely sure. But this is one of those diseases where we really can't tolerate a large minority of people not playing ball. Other public health endeavors like smoking, like the anti-smoking campaign, we have our tools for that. We have our billboards and our commercials and stuff. We still get like 15% of people who ignore it and smoke. And that's unfortunate, but they hurt themselves. With this, if 15% of people ignore it and are flouting guidelines, well, that's a recipe for disaster. So the amount of wiggle room we have for people to be irresponsible is quite small. I don't know what that smallness is, but it's definitely not 15%. It's less than that. So how do we deploy the communication tools better to convince people to take it more seriously? That's the question. And the nature of a pandemic like this, it's so explosive. It's all we need is a small ember to land on the wrong bit of dry shrubbery to set this off ablaze again, which is why we're so careful around the large indoor gatherings like karaoke bars, nightclubs, and schools, because they can trigger large explosive events which might lead to the dreaded second wave. So all I can say is I hope everyone gets on board and do their part most of the time. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just try your best most of the time.
And so how do you balance that then, those concerns that you've just raised with the reopening that as you said, has to happen. Dr. Bonnie Henry saying that schools have to reopen. These are things that have to move on. So how do you balance safety from the virus with the benefits that might come from having things like schools opening up?
Well, schools opening up are critical. I think that's a no-brainer, especially for younger children. For teenagers and above, like they can manage their own socialization, and so remote learning is quite possible for them, and the parents don't need to take a day off work to manage them at home for the most part. For younger kids, schools serve as a daycare, frankly, and also for them, schools aren't just a place of learning. They're a place where they go to encounter the world and to self-develop. So it's critical if we're going to invest in another generation of people to have schools open. So everything else is second to that in my mind, which means keeping bars open is not as important. Keeping restaurants open is not as important. Even respecting civil liberties to an extreme extent is not as important as this one thing. And I'm going to get into some trouble for saying that, but there comes a time when you have to bring forth the heavy hand of the law, perhaps, to compel people to behave in such a way that the schools can stay open. And I'm afraid we might not be able to keep them open for the extent of the semester. And I hope we get our plans a little more cohesive and comprehensive to allow it to happen.
And how do you ensure then that you have buy-in, continue to have public buy-in? When we talk about things like enforcement and heavy-handedness, how do you ensure that people are feel the weight of the problem enough, feel the concern enough to voluntarily and want to participate in these measures?
Well, that's a Nobel Prize winning question for the behavioral economics. But I will say that I think we need to explore the carrot and the stick. The is the force of the law. Do this or we'll fine you, or do this or we'll even apply criminal charges if you're infectious and you're going about infecting people. There's also the other kind of carrot, which is scolding, as we are fond of doing to young people, and that is going to push away a lot of people. The carrot, on the other hand, has not been fully explored, and the carrot is something like the heroism of doing the right thing, of saving your society, of saving your grandmother who will otherwise die unless you behave appropriately. Now, that's going to be an appealing message to some demographic and miss out on some others. So this isn't a one-size-fits-all communications endeavor. We have to deploy all of our tools simultaneously in order to appeal to a variety of niches. And you're going to miss some people. But the idea here is those few that you miss probably won't drive the pandemic as much as you missed 15 or 20% of them. So that is a good question. And if I had an answer, I'd be a world-famous individual with the ears of kings. But all I have is theories. And I will say, though, that we haven't fully explored the full extent of our communications tools yet. And we need to throw more resources and thinking around that.
So more around the communication. How do you, I guess, what's your message for people? There is this uncertainty, a level of anxiety as we head into the new school year. And here are the latest numbers now, 89 new cases as of yesterday in BC. And what's your overall message to British Columbians who are digesting that information and making plans for the year ahead?
It's a good question. And my message is this. This has never been about individual risk. It's always been about population risk. And that's a delicate thing to digest. Here's what I mean by that. If you do the math and figure out the number of active cases in your province, it's in the thousands. Divide that by the number of people in the province, which is in the millions. That gives you your probability of encountering someone with the disease. It's a very small number. And then you throw in your mask wearing and your distancing, that gives you your probability of actually getting it from that person. That's a really, really small number. So for most people, the overwhelming number of people, including kids and parents and grandparents, you're going to be just fine. You won't even know about this disease in your life. But when this is scaled up to thousands of schools and hundreds of thousands of kids, someone's going to get it, and someone's going to give it to their parents, and someone's going to give it to the grandparents, and someone's going to die. So it's a numbers game, meaning that at the community population level, this is a dire threat. At the individual level, it's not a reason to panic. That's a delicate communications message to get across to people if you don't study population health dynamics. But that's the way to think about this. So do not panic. Go forth with confidence and live your life, but be responsible in a adhering to the public health guidelines to protect your society and your community, because someone a couple of blocks over might die because of something you've done. It's the butterfly effect writ large. And this is no better opportunity to understand how we are all intimately interconnected than through an infectious disease like this. I probably won't die if I get infected because I'm youngish and healthy, but someone over in that neighborhood over there might because of something that I do. So this is a demonstration of the true nature of the interconnectedness of human society, and we need to digest that reality in a very profound way.
It is a lot of information, and I really appreciate your sifting through all of it and try to come up with some guidance for our listeners. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's Dr. Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist and associate professor in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of Ottawa.